Perfect. And we're recording. Welcome back, guys. Thank you so much. Today I'm joined by Nathan Smalley. Nathan is right now the Chief Technology Officer of Radiance Holdings. You were Chief Technology Officer of Liquor Split before that, and I've had kind of a whole host of different roles. Nathan, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
Nathan, before I go, anything about the background or anything else that I missed you want to call out about your background and your
Yeah, so I'm kind of one of those serial entrepreneurs. Started career in the 90s in military and big government and got into telco and always had one foot in startup companies, Idea Lab and all the early bubble companies and big tech. And then, I started a couple of my own companies. I've had three of my own, one nice exit, one okay exit, and the other one was a complete failure. So I've always been the CTO, the technology kind of co-founder, and I've always leaned on the product side.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, and so that leads right in. So if this is your first time listening to this conversation, the goal of these conversations are to bring leaders in the engineering space and help them guide folks in the QA space. Oftentimes you have your CTOs, your VPs of engineering who are more focused on developers, and sometimes QA are lacking in leadership. And so, Nathan, just to sort of start us off, can you share a little bit about your experience with setting expectation with QA in the organizations that you worked with, kind of what the role QA has played and kind of how it's developed across your career?
Yeah, so I think it's a good topic to talk about how it's developed because early on in my career, I thought that there was no need for QA because I was on the development side and thinking that good developers who put in build out their unit tests properly and good developers who understand the requirements and the scope should be able to move forward, and good product managers and good all of that can scope it properly. If the communication is there's no need for QA. But as reality sets in, especially with larger projects, more complex projects, QA is such a necessary part of it, and it becomes that glue that's needed. And so as my career advanced, I moved away from big enterprise systems and got into more apps, quick startups, as well as SaaS. A lot of software as a service companies I've worked with, as well as going in and helping to fix companies who built an app or built a SaaS platform that got in some trouble. Almost all the ones I've gone to, and I've gone to 13, I've helped 13 other startups that weren't my own, go in there and kind of help them and fix things. Almost all of them were weak in QA. It's a common trait when you go in that when there's a failed product launch early on in startups, they kind of skimp in this area. And the startups who understand and recognize that QA is just as important as having the right tools and having the right structure overall in software development, QA is just a big part of that. So I've learned the hard way sometimes, and also through the eyes of many co-founders, that QA is so important.
Yeah, I mean, that raises a really interesting point, which is, are there any continual themes you saw across those companies? And obviously you don't want to take shots at companies that you've worked with, but what are some of the themes that might have led them to be weak in QA? Was it time pressure, resource constraint, just not prioritizing it? Were there shared themes there that maybe are avoidable? Yeah,
so first thing that always comes to mind is time pressure and budgets. So especially with startup companies, but even for large enterprise projects that are planned well and tried to scope well and everything, sometimes they do fail in QA as well because they don't understand the role, the natural synergy of QA being more integrated into like the product development side, as well as kind of bringing together the developers in a way that's more enforcing for the process itself. So a lot of people will talk about how their software development process is and how Scrum, or they're following Kanban, or they're following some kind of modified process of their own. And everyone has their own little flavors, and they've read different books on capital A Agile and lowercase Agile and everything. But, QA is really that glue that brings us together. QA really helps you understand where the process is not working and is working. So I think that there's a glue orientation of bringing these pieces together that often gets overlooked because you may have an overbearing, very strong development organization. You may have a very strong leadership structure that has specific points of view on types of managing developers. So they feel that if they can manage it properly, then they can skimp in this area. And so QA gets squished a lot. But again, in my over the last 20 plus years, I've developed a structure where we have to have QA from the very beginning. And actually, I'll hire QA before I even bring in product development, product managers, and developers. And I'll start laying out structure with them. So oftentimes, you find like a good, strong product person and then kind of build out the team, or you find a really strong developer and build a team. But I built teams just on QA starting in the very beginning.
That's amazing, actually. I've always advocated for that. But it's what's interesting to listen to you talk about is so much of change in engineering organizations comes from top down, right? Top down sets the tone, top down sets. And I've heard at times, a rock star dev can help shift a development team to do some of these better practices. Have you ever seen QA be able to try to make change in a leadership team where maybe they've been resistant to it? Or is it just is it a non-starter? I know so much of it comes down to communication, but what's your perspective on an organization's ability to rethink itself when it comes to QA? And have you seen that happen consistently, or is it just kind of people get stuck in their ways?
People definitely get stuck in their ways. And the only way to allow a QA to impact the entire development organization is if leadership empowers them. So the one time that we did bring in a really QA oriented, a QA oriented person first, that person kind of was a little bit on the product side as well. Before we kind of brought in a product owner. So they kind of played that kind of role. So it was easy to put them in more of a leadership role. But the issue is that I have never seen it. It's very difficult, and I'm sorry, QAs out there, but like if the development team's already set in their ways, you have the leadership set in their ways, you bring QA in there, they're almost never able to fight their way. They have to pick and choose their battles, I guess you'd say, to make change.
Yeah, and that actually leads right into the next question, which I agree with a lot of those points. What should QA be able to expect from their leadership team's knowledge of QA itself, right? Because one of the shocking things about QA to a lot of people is it's really large and complex as an industry, and you have all kinds of types, you have different technology stacks. I see a lot of CTOs who are much more familiar with development tools, frameworks, than they are with making decisions on what should be automated, what should not be automated, load testing, security testing. What is today's CTO's responsibility from a knowledge perspective of QA? Do they have a responsibility? I'm just curious your perspective there. Yeah,
CTOs definitely have to have a responsibility, and they have to know every aspect of it. So, for example, heavy DevOps organization, depending on the deployment and release management strategies, they need to be able to have understand the frameworks and how the tools that will empower QA, the process that will empower QA. Organizations who are not used to having a full software development process when it comes to maybe the budget was tight and someone was wearing multiple hats for the QA and they're starting to develop that. They need to be able to take a look at their stack, what tech stack they're doing. They have to look at the scoping process and how it comes in and then be able to carve out very particular end-to-end boundaries of what the QA time is and what they're doing and what tools they're using. So there is a strong responsibility for the CTO in every role, not just QA, but to be able to make each one successful, right? You can't have a very successful development organization, extremely weak QA organization, because that will just bring down the entire process end to end. And you don't want to, the CTO also doesn't want to cause friction between these groups either, because the more that they synergize, the more that they're sharing tools, sharing knowledge, it's going to increase the speed and the velocity of the entire team. So having one area like demonize the QA or pick on them or you missed a bug or that kind of thing, and it's that simple, that black and white kind of simple. It's not that black and white simple. So everyone is responsible for every defect across the board, right?
Yeah. So in your background, what boundaries do you put in place for individual QA? And then the example that I'll give is, so often you have like, a customer service person who's been dropped into a manual QA role and they're still kind of learning it. And let's say they become good at manual testing. And then somebody comes along and is like, we're doing automation, right? And you're going to start automating this. And they don't really recognize that is a very different set of skills, much closer to development. What boundaries have you put on QA organizations in your career for focusing on success? Do you have people do manual testing and automation? Do you separate those? What kind of roles, responsibilities, boundaries have you used?
Yeah, I mean, I've brought in manual QAs often because oftentimes you don't have the frameworks or you're in such a rush that you haven't planned it out well. I mean, it's nice when you have something like a React stack, right? And you can just grab really quickly Jest or something like that like kind of is the normal plugin that everyone kind of uses for that kind of testing. But sometimes you bring in a unit, you bring in a QA who has just as good at clicking buttons and going through workflow process and very detail oriented. That's a great beginning to having some form of QA in there, and maybe they're not formally trained. I always take a QA and I move them towards understanding the frameworks and tools that they can use, either a browser stack or a larger Selenium, or being able to start playing with different types of unit testing, things of that nature, so that they understand the technical capabilities of a QA, that it's more than just pushing buttons and all that stuff. But those who come in as a manual tester, I usually buttress them with product development, product management, product ownership on that end, so they can really understand like what the user experience and the flow needs to be like. And so QAs that are lean towards non-technical in the beginning, I want them to really have a real close understanding and a real close relationship with that user acceptance, that user experience type side. But then there's always going to be a technical aspect that even if they don't like it and even if they don't get into automation, they should always have the understanding of how they fit. Because what you don't want to do as a QA is you don't want to walk into an organization and not have a point of view. Even if you have to adjust because of the political or because the developers are very strong-willed or whatever the legacy is, you need to be able to go in and say, well, this is a best practice. This is where I kind of fit into the whole ecosystem of QA with all the different tools and different technologies. And where I can either lean towards more on the product end, user experience end, or I can lean more towards DevOps, release management, or I can lean towards more like directly working with the developers for unit testing. But all of that starts with knowing where all the different pieces are, knowing where you fit, knowing where all the different areas are, knowing that there is differences, and having a very well-documented test plan. That is the number one thing for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I think what's interesting to listen to, that something came to mind as you were saying that, is thinking about growth as QA in organizations. One of the things that I see leadership teams don't do a great job of is presenting growth opportunities to QA. And you start to have people in the QA, because it's not like you have your junior devs and your senior devs. And some organizations, particularly in enterprise, are better about creating growth. But in the world of startups, I see a lot of organizations have a hard time showing a QA, here's where you're going to grow, here's where you're going to go. And you even referenced kind of putting them more into their business units and stuff like that. How have you approached, continuing to focus on showing growth opportunities to QA teams? Or is it an area that maybe you put them in QA for a year or two, then you shift them out into other areas? What's your perspective there?
It definitely has happened that way too. I've had people go into QA and then move to other areas, depending on what their skill set was. I've had people, we borrowed QA from even sales teams, and just because we want more testing and sometimes that happens, they're like, well, why would we hire a dedicated QA when we can just grab all the marketing people and sales people and have them push all the buttons and everything? So they don't understand that. But I think that, the job of leadership in technology, especially now, to understanding of what each role is and what each role's path is to success. And so, if I have a VP of engineering, I mean, that's one of his major things is like how each person in the organization can be successful and can feel like they have progression, right? And they're learning something, right? So even if they are a manual tester and they're just doing compatibility testing like iPhone and Android and stuff, and they're just clicking buttons on the actual phones and everything, they should know some of the frameworks and get some of the technology pieces as a mandated part of their training, even if it doesn't help with the project short term, it will long term. I mean, every CTO knows that when you scale with massive users and massive products, you're going to need automation. You're going to need more help. You're going to need more synergy in that role. And so if you look at some of the larger scaled out organizations, you'll see that they will all tell you they wish they put more into the QA in the very beginning. Now that's always easy to say that, that as they're already big, but they all say that because that is it's a hard thing to scale when you're kind of playing catch up in that area. So making sure each person in the organization, doesn't matter, developer, QA, product, they all have a progression path. That's not actually development and technology. That's just good management in general. And so that's something that QA people should understand is that if they're misunderstood in a development organization, it's not just because you're in tech. It could just be you have a bad manager.
Yeah, no, I think that oftentimes the first thing that managers struggle with is they don't quite understand even what they're managing. To shift it into more of a technical question, what's your perspective right now on continuous delivery, continuous integration, continuous deployment? Is it possible? Is it not possible? What I'm finding is a lot of CEOs are hearing this and they're hearing Facebook releases, whatever it was, 40 million lines of code or some crazy number of commits. What's your perspective on that? I think a lot of QA are threatened by that in some ways because it feels like they're getting pushed to the side. And I'm curious to know kind of your perspective on possible, not possible state of continuous delivery.
Yeah, so CI/CD is something that, I definitely implement in almost all the products I've worked with in the past in some way. But I think that the release management and DevOps process needs to be very careful about how there's different stages. So you can do, for example, CI/CD on the dev environment. That's a no-brainer. Do you do CI/CD on the QA environment, on the staging environment? So the answer that I would give many CTOs, and I've worked with different companies, is no. And if you only have a very weak QA and team, or maybe you have no QA team, or you have no QA automation, you don't have unit testing, you're not doing things like test-driven development, things of that nature, you're not mature, you're just running and gunning as fast as possible, I would not do CI/CD on QA. So I think it does matter on how mature your team is, how big your team is, your timelines, and being honest about many startup companies, they're going so fast, it's impossible to really implement best practice, right? So yeah, like Facebook can say all they want. They have a massive organization. They have a massive amount of money too, and also they can afford it. So I think there's all these different factors to look at, but you have to align your release process with the entire organization. So, and I think that CI/CD is one of those things that you phase in through maturity of the organization. Yeah. And
I mean, I would imagine even like something like blue-green deployments, like, okay, you're going to go something like write a line of code, hit production. Well, at least make sure you're only hitting production with like 5% of your traffic. Don't like just drop it fully in. In the last 2-3 minutes, I mean, what's one or two questions about QA or points about QA that you want to make that you feel like I've not touched on so far?
I think we've touched on a lot.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I think that I think the big thing is encouraging people that QA is important, and QA has many different career paths, which gives you a little bit of a nice introduction. So if you're out there, you're kind of maybe you're on the edge, you're of a junior developer. It's easy to get into an organization and get into technology through QA and kind of work on some of these testing frameworks and kind of play in it. And you can touch on product marketing, product management. You can go into DevOps, really, and you can get more hardcore into development. So I think that QA is a great path for newer folks who are coming in. I think that you are right, though. There's a lot of misunderstanding of their role, because it's not just a transition role. It's not just a role that you go into to get someplace else. You can be just in QA and have a career path as well. You just have to know the different levels they are, and you have to go to organizations who appreciate it and know how to absorb it. But there is a compromise there always. There's always going to be a compromise there, because sometimes the CEO will just say, "We got to get this out, and we have no money. Let's go as fast as possible, and cut every corner." And that's all there is to it, right?
Yeah. I think you used the word glue at the beginning of this conversation, and that resonated a lot, and I appreciated that point a lot. Nathan, thank you so much for joining. I really enjoyed it, and I wish I could probably talk to you for another hour about this, but I'm trying to keep these at 20 minutes, so I appreciate you joining me today.
All right. Thanks, everyone.